was happening in the first part of chapter 8.
What was happening all the time? Jesus is talking and he's getting flat for it.
I know. There was a woman last week who said, the Bible study, she's like, I can't remember, but I'm guessing that Jesus made the leaders mad. I was like, that's right. Okay, so, well, let's just do a little review. He called himself the light of the world. How did that go?
Not well.
Nope, it didn't. What was the reaction? It was the Pharisees that he got into it with. Do you remember anything he said to them or they said to him?
Are they the ones that said he had a demon?
Yeah, that did come up. It's going to come up again today.
That they don't know his father.
Yeah. Yep.
They told him that his witness wasn't true, it was just a witness of himself.
Yep, that he's testifying on his own behalf.
And also where he comes from came into dispute, that it doesn't come from Galilee. The Christ doesn't come from Galilee.
Which is ironic because he comes from Bethlehem, but we know he actually does come from Bethlehem. But the bigger issue is they think they know where he's from, but really his origins are heavenly, and that's the bit they're missing. And so they're just not, it's like they and Jesus are always talking past each other because he's talking about bigger spiritual things, and they can't see it. They can't understand what he's saying. They can't hear what it is that he's telling them about himself. So he said, when they still didn't understand, toward the end of the passage we looked at last week, he said, when you've lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am not on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me. I mean, this idea that when the crucifixion finally comes, the crucifixion and the resurrection is going to leave no doubt about who he is and the authority that he has. And, well, even then, there are going to be people who won't believe. But, yeah, go ahead, Barb.
Do you think the people watching the crucifixion understood that he was dying for our sins?
Some of them might have, but I think most of them didn't. Because you remember what the Jews were saying and the Pharisees as they walked by? If he's the Messiah, why can't he bring himself down from there? That's what people were saying. He could heal everybody else, but he can't save himself. That was the attitude that not everybody, but a lot of people had.
But he, as the Messiah, he wasn't supposed to be dying. He was supposed to be gathering an army and getting them free from the Romans.
According to what they were expecting, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
He says, you'll believe me after that. I mean,
Well, he says, then you'll know who I am. Whether they put their faith in him is another story. Yeah. Yeah. So the last thing it said in verse 30 was, even as he spoke, many put their faith in him. Now it's these people that we're going to pick up with now in the section that comes next. So let's read chapter 8, 31 to 59. To the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free? Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know you are Abraham's descendants, yet you are ready to kill me because you have no room for my word. I am telling you what I have seen in the Father's presence, and you do what you have heard from your father. Abraham is our father, they answered. If you were Abraham's children, said Jesus, then you would do the things Abraham did. As it is, you are determined to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do such things. You are doing the things your own father does. We are not illegitimate children, they protested. The only father we have is God himself. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and now am here. I have not come on my own, but he sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Yet because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? If I'm telling the truth, why don't you believe me? He who belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God. The Jews answered him, "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?" "I am not possessed by a demon," said Jesus, "but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I am not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. I tell you the truth, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." At this the Jews exclaimed, "Now we know that you are demon-possessed. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. Yet you say that if anyone keeps your word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are?" Jesus replied, "If I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old," the Jews said to him, "and you have seen Abraham. I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. It's kind of intense, isn't it? Jesus stirred him up and getting flack for it, that's right. Okay, so how does the next section begin? Okay, again, who's Jesus talking to?
The Jews.
And the Jews
Who
who
have
believed in him. That's very interesting. So when you read that whole section, it can be a bit confusing because it says they believe in him, but everything that comes after it makes it sound like they don't believe in him. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is exactly what John has been telling us already, and we've previously seen it over and over and over. There's belief and there's belief. And right here, we're going to see the believers get weeded out from the believers. We're going to see what genuine faith looks like and how it responds, or what, maybe I should say, what unbelief looks like and how it responds to Jesus. So there's a kind of fickle faith that accepts what Jesus says until he starts to rub the listeners the wrong way. And when he does that, their faith becomes reluctant and defensive and even defiant. Okay, so how is genuine faith distinguished from fickle faith? Well, Jesus tells us. What does he say in verse 31?
That if you abide in my word, the truth will be in you, and it will set you free.
Yes. Now, when he says abide in his word, what do you think he means by that? That's going to be a big topic later on in John, but let's just talk about it a little bit. What are you doing if you abide in his word or you remain in his word?
Ever since I listened to John Piper speak on this, the illustration where he gave, and it's what clearly he's like, if you abide in it, he's like, you're making room. He's like, you're setting up furniture. When God's word abides in you, you're making a home for it. You are moving out the things that don't work. You're putting in the couch. You're making this home because you are abiding in that word. Like you are living in it. And I was like, that was the best illustration. I was like, oh, he's like, it's what you're living in. He's like, you can believe in it, but if it's not something that you're actually living in, to abide, to reside in it.
Yeah. So the people, I mean, and it's not just the scripture. Like right here, it's Jesus saying the things I'm saying right now, the stuff that's coming out of his mouth right now. You have to live with that in the best possible sense. What I mean, live with it, that kind of makes it sound like get over it. That's not what Jesus is saying. It's this should be your life. The things coming out of his mouth right now these are the things of life. So take it in and remain in it, persevere in it. And this is the thing that Jesus says over and over and over, is that genuine faith perseveres. Genuine faith perseveres through ups and downs, it perseveres through prosperity, it perseveres through suffering, and it perseveres through the offense of Jesus' word, which is what we're going to see as this passage goes on. Will they persevere through the offense of Jesus' word? Will they remain in his word when he's telling them things they don't want to hear? And he says, he tells them right at the beginning, if you hold to that teaching, if you remain in my word, that means you're truly my disciples, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Okay, now, what does that mean? Well, when Jesus talks about the truth, he's always talking about himself and his message. So how does an understanding of Jesus and his message set people free? Well, the freedom depends on the nature of the bondage you're in to start with, right? And That's the issue now between Jesus and these people, is what he sees as their bondage is not what they would see as their bondage. So that's where he's going to go next. Now, when he says that, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, how did the people react?
Well, they said they were Abraham's descendants and they had never been in bondage. So how could you say that they'll make us free?
Yeah. And I think when they say this, I think they get the point that Jesus is talking about something spiritual. The reason I think that is because of the direction this conversation goes anyway. We know that they've been slaves in Egypt before, right? They were slaves for 400 years. And I don't think they've all forgotten about that. I think that they know Jesus isn't talking about physical bondage. He's talking about some kind of a spiritual bondage. Why would being Abraham's descendants mean that they have never been in spiritual bondage? What do you think they're thinking about when they say that? What is it about being descended from Abraham that gives them some kind of privilege?
Okay, they've got a straight, their lineage is Jewish,
Yep,
and they know they've been set apart.
that's
so-
right. They're the recipients of the covenant, right? Ever since the time of Abraham, the Jews have had the privilege of knowing who God was, being called into covenant with him, having the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, all this revelation about who he is in the law. I think their assumption is we're descended from Abraham. We know the truth of who God is, not like those pagans over there. So how can you tell us that we'll be set free when we know the truth? It's like their lineage is the source of their confidence. The fact that they have this history from Abraham, that's where they get their spiritual confidence from.
Sally, as you said, but I just had the thought of, it's like, let me show you my birth certificate.
Yep.
It says right here, and Jesus has had conversation with, it's that born again birth certificate that matters. And you can't show me your born again certificate.
Yeah, or when you said that, it made me think of something I heard a pastor say once. He said, if someone asks you if you're alive, what do? You pull out your birth certificate and say, look, I'm alive. No, you're like, here, feel my pulse, you know? And he said the same thing is true spiritually, isn't it? That all kinds of people, if you say, are you spiritually alive? It's like, well, on this date, I prayed this prayer and I signed it. No, do you have a spiritual pulse? That's the question. And that's what Jesus is going to get at in the next bit that comes is, how do you know you have a spiritual pulse? What is it you're actually in bondage to? It's not paganism, it's something else. And that's where he goes next. So what does he say in response to that when they say, we've never been free and we don't need to be slaves and we don't need to be freed?
Everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin.
So he's talking about something a lot bigger than the Jewish religious traditions or the lineage of these people or the covenant that they've had since the time of Abraham. The slavery he's talking about isn't paganism, it's sin. And everyone who sins is a slave to sin, which means everyone is a slave. Everyone. So the ultimate slave master isn't Egypt, and it's not Caesar, and it's not even false religion. It's sin. And then Jesus adds to that slaves have no permanent place in the family like a son does. Think about the weight of him saying that to a group of Jews. When he's basically saying, you think you have a place in the family, but you don't. Because if you're a slave to sin, slaves don't have a permanent place. Who does have a permanent place in the family? The son does. And there is only one son who has a permanent place in the family, and that's Jesus. So he's the one, the son with a capital S, who has the permanent place in God's family, but he has the authority to free the slaves and to make them part of God's family. Freedom from sin is the ultimate liberation. That's what he's come to accomplish. And he says, if the Son frees us, we're truly free. And then we have a permanent place in God's family because we get the same inheritance, the same rights, the same privileges that the Son himself does. He brings us into a relationship with God that mirrors the relationship that he has with the Father. Now you'd think they'd be like, hooray, that's what we want. But it's not. So he's going to keep going here. What does he say then in 37 and 38? I mean, he could have just stopped there, but he doesn't.
He says, you're trying to kill me.
Yep.
And he says, I'm
bit ominous right there, isn't it? Yep. Mm-hmm.
We're in different camps.
Yes. The Jews might put their spiritual confidence in being descended from Abraham, but Jesus just straight out challenges that confidence. They think they have the moral high ground because of their lineage, but Jesus says they're looking for ways to kill him because they won't believe what he says. That's pretty heavy. But he knows the people better than they know themselves. Now what's really interesting is that at the moment, it's the Jewish leaders who are looking for ways to kill Jesus. But we've read to the end of the chapter and you know what's coming. That he's standing there saying, you're looking for ways to kill me. And I bet there are all kinds of people saying, no, we're not. But they're going to before the conversation's over. Jesus knows their hearts better than they know it themselves. And he knows where they're headed when he says the kinds of things that he's going to say to them. It's like he gives them a little warning right here ahead of time. Like, pay attention to what's going on in your hearts. Because he knows what's coming. Now, he says he's telling them what he's seen in the Father's presence. They're doing what they've heard from their Father. Yeah, it's like, dun, dun, dun. Their own Father is clearly not God, from what Jesus is saying. So how do they react to that?
Abraham is our father.
Mm-hmm.
Again, go back to that lineage.
Yes. And what does Jesus say?
If you were Abraham's children, then you would do what Abraham did.
Yes. Now let's talk about that for a minute. What is it that Abraham did that Jesus is talking about right here? When the promises of God came to Abraham, how did he react? Yeah. He believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15 says. So there were all these promises that God made, that he would give him a son, that he would give him more descendants than could be counted, that he would give them the inheritance of the land, that all the nations would be blessed through his seed. God gave all these promises to Abraham, and Abraham took him at his word and believed. Not that Abraham didn't stumble, not that he didn't trip up or sin, because he did, but he heard those promises and he believed. And now the word of God is coming to these people, and they're responding exactly the opposite of the way Abraham did. Remember what Jesus said right at the beginning of this. If you're disciples, you will remain in my word. What are they doing? They're rejecting it. I mean, they're rejecting it over and over and over. These people who believed in him, or at least they profess to believe in him, are just continually rejecting the word of Jesus as the conversation goes on. So he says, if you were really the descendants of Abraham, not physically, but spiritually, morally, ethically, if you were descended from Abraham, you would believe the way he believed. You would accept the promises of God and believe. But instead of doing that, they're looking for a way to kill him. When he's told them the truth. He's telling them the truth, and he's told them that truth will set them free. And instead of taking hold of the truth and the freedom that comes with it, they're trying to think of a way to kill him. Abraham didn't do stuff like that. And so he says in 41, you're doing the works of your own father. Well, again, okay, so they claim God as their father, and Jesus is like, nope. And then they claimed Abraham as their father, and Jesus is like, nope. So who's their father? Well, he's about to stick it to them. So how do the people answer when he says, you're doing the works of your own father?
We aren't illegitimate.
That's right. They, whatever they don't understand, they do understand that he's implying some kind of spiritual illegitimacy by what he's just said. Mm-hmm. And they do not appreciate that comment from Jesus. And so they say they're not illegitimate children. They're the Father of God himself. And what does Jesus say?
If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here.
Yeah, the Son has been sent from God. Jesus hasn't come on his own. And there is loads of testimony to support that fact. If God were really their Father, they would love the Son. Because the Son and the Father are a package deal. But they don't understand. They don't understand what he's saying. And it's not because he's been unclear. It's because they're spiritually unable to hear it. Why can't they hear it?
Because his word doesn't abide in them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
I was thinking, I'm like, they're not even illegitimate children. They're not even children.
Yep.
Like, there's a difference between being the bastard child and not even being of the same family.
That's right. And who's their father?
Yeah.
Man, he just says it right. Wow. That's the problem. That's why they're not hearing him. That's why they're not understanding him, is because he says they're children of their father and their father is Satan.
Doesn't that verse in, I think it's 43, to me it's a pleading, why don't you understand what I'm telling you? To me it's an invitation from Jesus, still saying, why don't you believe me? To me it says that. And he said that again in the other one,
Yeah.
another verse, where
Yeah.
it just sounds to me like he wants them to believe.
Mhm.
He wants them to know him.
Yeah.
Well, later on, when he goes to Jerusalem, he stands on a hill over Jerusalem and he is the
Yes, Christ.
So,
Yeah.
Always got his arms out.
Yep. Yeah. It's really strong for Jesus to say to these people, the problem isn't that you haven't seen enough miracles. The problem is your father is the devil. That's why you and I are talking past each other. And he says, you do what your father wants. And then how does he describe Satan? How does he describe their father? Yep. He's a liar and a murderer. Well, that seems to fit. From the very beginning, from his first interaction with human beings, he's been a liar and a murderer. There's no truth in him. Lies are his mother tongue. He's the father of lies. Jesus is the truth. He's the total opposite of that. And when he speaks the truth, the people don't believe him because they are just on totally opposite sides of each other. And Jesus, then he adds, again, why don't they understand him? Or why are they rejecting him? It's not because he's guilty of some sin. It's not because he's a scoundrel. It's because they don't belong to God. Whoever belongs to God hears what God says. The fact that they don't hear shows that they don't belong to God. The very God they claim as their father. Which is going to come back. This is going to come back again in chapter 10. And it showed up before when he gets to the passage about the Good Shepherd. This kind of thing is all over the place. That if you belong to him, you will hear his voice. Why can they not hear him? Because they don't belong to the same father that he is.
My study Bible had a note that I appreciated. Sonship is predicated on behavior. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the paper says, it matters what your actions.
Well, yeah, we say like father, like son, don't we?
Yeah.
Your children resemble their parents at some point. And if they're completely the opposite of Jesus, then there's a problem higher up with who their father is. Okay, now how do the people react to that in 48?
Well, they discredit what he says and says he has a demon.
Mm-hmm.
And then they say you're a Samaritan,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of confusing.
Well, I think they figure if he's going to challenge their paternity, they're going to challenge his. So the first thing they do is call him a non-Jewish mixed-race infidel.
So that's just, like, you know,
With demons.
And demon-possessed.
Okay, so it's just an insult.
It is. It's a very serious racial insult that puts him outside of the Jewish community. I don't think they really think that. I think they're just pulling out the worst insults they can think of because they're mad. Do you?
call someone, they call the Samaritans dogs. So they're basically,
Yeah, a Samaritan and demon-possessed. Like, yeah. Do you feel the tension ratcheting up through this passage? Like you can feel them getting angrier as the conversation goes on.
Well, and you're not, I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're spiritually blind, you can't take that kind of criticism and do something with it.
Mhm.
You're just kind of angry.
Yeah.
And bitter, and all of those sins are really, you are enslaved to it. You're enslaved to your bitterness and your pride, and
Yeah.
it's just not a surprise.
It's not.
it's the original cancel culture.
Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun. So
Right.
And yet, so let me ask you, does it ever surprise you when unbelievers get angry? It shouldn't, but I for a long time I just kind of thought, if you're nice to people and you get along and you be a good neighbor and a good employee and all that stuff, of course people will like you. But the problem is that if there is something of the gospel in that, there's going to come a point where you rub the world the wrong way. You can be the best neighbor ever, and at some point people are going to get offended because It's not about you, it's about God, and if you don't have the same Father, at some point, you're not gonna see things the same way. And it shouldn't surprise us that people get angry about sometimes I think, well, if you don't like the gospel, just stop listening to that podcast, stop reading that blog, But it shouldn't surprise us that people get angry and they want to say strong things about it.
Well, 'cause he has to change our heart. And like, I remember when we first started learning about the doctrines of grace, and when Jed, and realizing when Jed was like, okay, so is God sovereign? Is he in control of it all? And even though I'd grown up in church and, gone to a Christian high school largely, gone to a Christian college, and knew a lot, but I hadn't. And I remember it's like, I wanted a part in my salvation. And it was a work of God. I was mad at first. I relate to these people because I was like, oh, no. I did things. I am good. And I remember wrestling for a good couple months. And so, I get it. I really, really feel for them because I remember feeling that way of like, oh, how dare you tell me it's all you and not me. And like, so.
Because I have to play some role.
I have to. I'm important. I've done important things. I've been good. So I really relate to them here, I guess. It's like I get their feeling.
And it's back to that same thing we see over and over in John. What is the biggest obstacle to belief? It's not lack of evidence, it's pride. If the problem is lack of evidence, the people just don't know enough, then a well laid out argument or another big miracle would take care of it. But it doesn't, because the biggest problem is human pride, and God is the only one who can deal with that.
I think that's so powerful, because I think when you talk about pride, that sort of, like in my own heart, I think sometimes like God is transactional, like why do I deserve, or why can't I be good and God give me good? It doesn't work like that. And some people don't do good and get good.
Dang it.
And the Psalms talk so much. Amy, that Psalm 123 talks so much about that. People just coming before the Lord and saying like, why aren't you this transactional God? I do good, you give me good. And that is not how God, in his wisdom, he doesn't work that way. And at some point, you do have to transition from, abiding in his word, which says, my main concern is your holiness and you becoming like Christ. And maybe that's through difficulty, and maybe that's through disappointment and like loosening your grip on the good things of the world and like, trying to somehow transcend your circumstances and disappointments and thwarted plans, that God has something better. But it's that perseverance, the abiding piece, that in some way when you break through, like in some of those circumstances, you kind of break through and you see, like God, you get a glimpse of his plan, and you're like, whoa, that was worth it. That was really worth it. And so, but again, it's God, we don't understand. Our human minds just cannot comprehend his wisdom. And it's not transactional, which is sometimes a bitter pill. No, go ahead, Miriam.
Just this morning, in the reading was, make your plans tentative and understand that his sovereignty, his ways are always perfect. And it was like, oh, if I would just, from the core of my being, surrender that. Because it's like, okay, but it's like, I gotta get this done today. You don't get it, God. This is what has to happen today. And sometimes he said, I gotta detour here.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I need to go with that. I need to say, God's got something that I can't see, but it's not like that's not my natural mode. Because I've got places to go and people to see, right? Even if it's just four little boys.
Well, that's the downside of grace, is that you're not in control.
Yeah.
If God relates to us entirely by grace, that means we can never manipulate him, we can never bribe him, we can never get him in our debt. There's no sacrifice so big that you can say, okay, God, now you owe me. That all of that's just off the table. And that great grace sounds great, doesn't it? Until you realize I can't control God if the whole relationship is grace. It puts him fully in control. Yeah.
Well, and it's also what Amy was saying about how that, well, I did all this, I did all these good things, and what you were saying too about like you should get good back. And, it doesn't, it's not like that necessarily, because what he came to do and the grace that we know is from sin. So it's really, and that has a negative connotation, as does suffering, but that's like where we meet him the most, and where his love and all comprehension of his love and to abide in that is found is through our sin and his releasing us from that. So it's not from being good at all, it's the opposite. It's not from, doing all these things, which we think is like that's where, I'm going to get blessed, I'm going to, go up and up. It's through like the most sin. In fact, like Paul was the worst. He said, I am the worst of sinners, and that look at how God used him. And it's through suffering, it's through trial that he that's where he meets us in that kind of,
And when we surrender that, we can use, I'm sure everybody's experienced that. There's something that was so devastating, and when you finally say, it's yours, Lord, and he walks you through it and keeps you going, then it may be decades, but at some point he may be able to use that because you understand in a way that nobody else can, and he can connect those dots.
I used this illustration at the last Bible conference, so some of you might have heard it, but I remember one time I had a roommate. Well, let me just preface it by saying there's this parable that Jesus tells that really rubs me the wrong way, or it used to. This parable about the workers in the field, and how there's two groups of workers, and there are the people who come early and the people who come late, and they all get paid at the end. That parable has always rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm just like, it is not fair. And if you work all day, you should get more than the people who show up late. Can you tell, like, I was the kid in small groups in school who did all the work, and everybody else, like, just bugs me. That's right. And so I remember talking to a housemate of mine one time, and we got to talking about this parable, and I mentioned to her that it just rubs me the wrong way, and she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, it's just unfair. It's unfair." And she said, "Where do you see yourself in the parable?" And I said, "Well, at the beginning, in the first group." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I've been a believer since I was this high, it's." And she said, "Yeah, I get that." She said, "But here's the thing. In the larger context that Jesus is talking in, he's not talking about how long you've been a believer. He's talking about Jews and Gentiles. And if you're a Gentile, you're automatically in the second group." And I was like, oh, well, that changes everything. I was like, I love grace. Don't you love grace? I'm so glad that I get all the privileges when I don't deserve it. Isn't it amazing how your perspective on grace depends a lot on your perspective about what you think you deserve?
Yeah, sure, true.
And where your pride is?
Right.
You know?
You value it so much more when you've really sinned, when you've really broken things,
Yep.
or broken relationships, and done things that you're just kind of like, well, in human terms, this should never be forgiven. But
Yeah.
in God's economy, it is. And there is something about that we don't like,
Yep.
to be honest, because it's like, well, that's not fair,
And underneath that is
Goodness for it.
is the assumption I deserve better than what I'm getting,
Right.
which is never the case with God. He's never giving us worse than we deserve. It's always the other way around.
Yeah.
But I mean, even as a believer, I can just feel that pride starting to seep in and thinking, God, I deserve better than this. Or, why are you treating me this way? Because I had my devotions this morning, and so why is this going badly right now, And now we're in that kind of transactional, I do this for you and you do this for me, and I stop thinking about God as a God of grace.
I wonder, because I'll admit, I feel a lot of pride about myself sometimes, because I haven't done anything terribly, horribly wrong. But I guess I'm wondering, but
On the outside.
right, no, I totally get that. I know that I have a problem, because I don't really feel like I need to come to God and say, God, I am really sorry for my sin. I don't really feel like that on a day-to-day basis, and there is something wrong. And so, I guess I'm wondering, how do we get there? I mean, how do we really, when we're reading God's Word, how do we get to that point where it's like, I really am sorry, even though, there is nothing that I have done. I'm not blaspheming God, I'm not, but
It's a work the Spirit has to do.
right? I mean, there is something in me that says, there is something wrong. You're you're not getting it. You're not comprehending the problem. I'm just being honest. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of people struggle with this.
Hey, I was a
But
missionary in
I'm here at
Africa.
Bible study.
A missionary in Africa. You want to talk about pulling rank on people? I was a missionary in Africa. There are days when I'm just like, God, I went to Africa.
Right.
I deserve this. I was in a Sunday school class once where somebody was like, well, it's not like we're all going to be missionaries in Africa. And I was like, tick! What does that get me? I mean, I know what you're saying,
Yeah.
because there's all of this, there's still this tendency to think, okay, not only have I not done all these horrible things that lots of other people have done, but look at all the good things I've done. I mean, let me just lay out my record for you, God.
Right.
And then you read Philippians, and you see Paul laying out his record and saying, actually, all of that is garbage. It counts as nothing when it comes to knowing Christ. And in fact, some of that stuff stands in my way. And if any of that stuff gets in the way, I'm done with it. Because I want to know Jesus so much that, let's be done with all of that. It's a work of the Spirit. And I get what you're saying. I totally do.
I'm just trying to be honest. I
Yeah.
really feel like this is the pivotal problem in my Christian faith. It is definitely something that is a blind spot.
And I think
for
it's a
me.
problem for most people who grow up even if you're not going to church all the time, if you grow up in a sort of Christian environment,
Yeah.
or in a home where, things go well and stuff, it's very easy to grow up thinking,
I'll
I'm a
share
good
what-
person.
I'll
Yeah,
share
go ahead.
what caused that transformation for me is that I was just so bad. It wasn't even,
No.
I almost died. I was in jail.
Don't go to jail, Leah.
Yeah. I'm not telling you to go to jail, but you know
Yeah.
when,
Mentally.
you've messed up so much that,
Yeah.
he saves you, that you have that level of sin. You sometimes almost, not telling, and that's why it sounds,
No.
not telling you to sin, but or you go through a trial that's so bad that is also kind of comparative, that
I do understand.
you're gonna die otherwise. Life is over as you know it.
Yeah. That's the thing. I know this sounds crazy, Nanette, but sometimes I envy people who have had those breaking moments. Because if you don't have those, I feel like sometimes I'm afraid to say, God, do with me what you will, and show me that I am truly.
That's terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Do you pray, because sometimes I'll pray, I'm like, show me where the sin is at that I need to work on.
Well, and David says.
And I'll pray that, open my eyes, let me see what is hindering me with you. Reveal
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
I'll pray that sometimes, and even then sometimes I'm kind of begrudgingly praying it. Because I'm like,
But don't show me too much.
don't show me too much, 'cause I don't want to see it.
Well, and I just think if you have this attitude, then you are being
are sinners, period.
In our
Even if
hearts.
we never did anything actually wrong. I mean, we look at a baby and we say, well, a baby's never sinned. And in a sense, yes, that's true. It's never done actual sin, but it's still a sin. And we are still sinners and we still need to be
Don't name them actual
saved.
sins just because we can see them.
But
Don't say actual sins just because we can see them. They're still sinners. The sins in our heart are still actual sins.
yes, yes.
Even though you can't see them, and that's where I
Right.
was going with this, you know.
Yeah.
When I became a Christian, it was easy for me to give up drinking and smoking dope and fornicating and some of those, you know, all those things that could be seen
Yeah.
on the outside. But as I grew in my Christianity and realized my jealous heart
Yeah.
and my selfish heart, and those are things that are a whole lot harder to give up
Oh,
than
Oh,
those physical things that we see.
So true.
right.
I think that's where I'm at, and I think that's why I know the Holy Spirit is doing the right thing in my life, because I have a problem with being the way that I am internally.
And if the Spirit weren't at work, you wouldn't care.
Right. And it's not as, and it is also to the point, I think, where I see it, my loved ones see it, my child sees it. And I just think the ugliness that if I allow it, you know, it's like God talks about the root of bitterness. It
Yeah.
is there.
That's a deep one.
It's deep, and God knows, you know, and He's the only one who can remedy these things. And if you don't subject yourself to His light, which is such a powerful analogy, then He will let you spin out of control. He will, until you see, I think, the outcome of your choice to hold on to some of that darkness and let it just reside there. So,
But I think the comfort with that, I think He will allow you to see in your life. But if you are one of His, and you are His life, He won't let you spin so far out of control that you're outside of His control.
no, He's sovereign.
Yeah,
That's
He
the
will
beauty of it.
keep you in His hand, and
Yeah.
He will keep you. And He will keep you to the end. But that doesn't mean there won't be any consequences, or He won't teach you the lessons that need to be taught
Yeah.
to bring you.
And I was raised to be the nice, good girl. I was, and I was, because my brother was such a scoundrel. I wasn't a hard competition. But then the judgment that you're able to bear out of that. And I think to this day, for me, that's the wrestling match too. It's like, and boy, does he call me short. There's enough people in my life that it's like, after I've said something or spoken, or whether I've spoken or just thought it, it's like, oh, I would like me to shine the light on you in that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's so humbling, because at that point I know that's my sin. And, but it's, like you said, you know it's been nailed to the cross, but I just think there's pieces of that, but this side of eternity, we're never gonna walk free of it. But there's something incredible about facing it and recognizing it and knowing you wouldn't, I just don't think you would have that conviction apart from the Holy Spirit.
I'm sorry to go down this rabbit hole.
No,
But,
no,
you know,
it's
it
real, it's live.
it is. It really is. Yeah. So I appreciate that.
In my experience, God didn't show me all my sin all at once, thank you. And
Yeah.
through the
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
little by little, He brings boots,
Yeah.
just needs to be confessed and dealt with. I'm not there yet. But that was been nice.
That's a good thing. Yeah, God is really merciful.
And He always loves us, and He always forgives us. That's what's so comforting about it all, is that you can feel the way you do and have that struggle, but you know still that He loves you. And that what you're dealing with, He's still forgiving you in that.
Right.
You know, He's,
Yeah. And just the fact that the fact that He cares enough to, like you said, peel back the onion slowly. you know, is evidence of his grace and mercy. So I so appreciate that. But yeah, I want to be more than a surface person. I want to be a deep believing person, you know, and be able to face trial and persevere. So it's just really great. He talks about that over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's so true. It's so true.
And I think the longer I've gone in John, the more I've realized there is no force on earth more destructive than human pride.
Yes.
There just isn't. And I don't think I take that seriously enough. How destructive pride is, how destructive my own pride is, apart from God softening my heart.
Yeah.
But if pride is just something you kind of get, you just live with it so much that it starts to feel comfortable, you know, until God sort of pulls you up short. And it's painful. I mean, just having your pride converted is painful, but it's really destructive.
Because sometimes it's like God says just what they said to him. Who do you think you are?
Yeah.
I had him turn the table on me. More than once.
Pride like literally blocks like every natural emotion.
You
Like
what?
pride blocks
Oh.
every natural human emotion and deeper spiritual contact with God. Like it blocks peace, it blocks love, it blocks humility, it blocks joy, except for joy in yourself, which isn't real. Happiness, like all of those spiritual blessings that we can only have through Him, you know, through humbling and being in that space with Him. It blocks all those.
And you put yourself at the center. You know, everything that happens is an offense to you. It's like, no. Like David said, I have sinned against you and only you, even though he had sinned against so many people, right? But God is the center. He is the one who's at the center of this story, not us. And so it's kind of like, that is the problem with pride too. It's, you put yourself in the center of Him first. And it's not about God's glory. It's not about serving Him and loving Him. It's about getting what's due to you. And you can just really go down the wrong path that way.
Yes.
And he's so incomprehensible then, that when we try to put it in our human perspective, and I keep thinking about, you know, this was decades ago when James Dobson interviewed a convicted murderer, and he'd done all these atrocious, do you remember, I can't even think of who the murderer's name was.
Ted Bundy.
Yes, yes. And, you know, whether or not the confession was real or not, God alone knows, but people were outraged that Bundy, because out of that, Dobson's, you know, it's like, if this man's confession is true, we'll see him in heaven. And people were outraged that this man who had done these terrible things could possibly be in heaven. And that's kind of what, you know, what we've kind of been talking about. It's like, mine doesn't measure. I mean,
Grace offends us.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in our natural state, grace offends us.
and how would
It
God
does.
allow that?
Yep.
Which again challenges His sovereignty.
They always say we're gonna be shocked in heaven.
Who's there and who
Who's
isn't?
on the cross.
All right, speaking of pride, what does Jesus say when the people call him a Samaritan and demon possessed?
I do not have a demon. Go ahead. 57.
49. Yeah. He says, I'm not demon possessed. Okay, now the first thing that caught my attention is that he didn't say, I'm not a Samaritan. He could have thrown the Samaritans under the bus right there. Why do you think he didn't?
Because they're believed.
Because they believed. That's right. I mean, back in chapter 4, he had this conversation with the woman at the well, and they believed, the whole village believed, and they believed without a miracle. Why would Jesus be offended to be associated with Samaritans? He wouldn't. And so, you know, he could have just gone off and said, stop calling me names like, you know, I'm not a filthy Samaritan. No, but I don't think he's at all. offended by being associated with those people who believed in him. He just doesn't even go there. But he does say, I'm not demon possessed. And then what does he say?
If you dishonor me, and they were dishonoring him by saying that in the tone of voice they said.
Yeah.
Or, you know.
Yeah. And he says, I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Where's the glory for Jesus coming from? Is it coming from his mouth, or is it coming from somewhere else? Yep. It's like he's not seeking glory for himself. The Father's seeking it for him, and then he says the Father's the judge. All of which is to say it's really dangerous territory these people are wading into, because when they dishonor Jesus, they dishonor the Father, and that kind of rejection will lead to judgment by the Father. But whoever obeys Jesus' word, he says, will never see death. And this is spiritual death. The eternal life that comes through the Son can't be extinguished by physical death. Okay, now how do the people react to that in 52 and 53?
Now we know you have to.
Why? What is it that he just said that just works them up even more?
At the end of verse 51, he says, truly I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very confusing and inciting, incendiary
Uh-huh.
statement.
Yeah. And what's their argument against that in 52 and 53?
Abraham died, the prophet died. It makes me think so much of where the idea of our mouths being open to is that we're dead in our sins and trespasses, like people not realizing these, they're already dead. They don't know they're dead,
That's right.
and that they're just walking corpses, and they're dead. They don't know they're dead, and so really, I mean, it's not that Jesus is saying that's like, it's not that you're never gonna see, you're gonna see life, and once you have that life, you'll never go back to that state of death.
Just like they don't know they're in bondage,
Right.
they also don't know they're dead. They don't know they're in bondage, so they don't think they need to be freed. They don't know they're dead, so they're missing the things Jesus is saying about life. Yeah, and their whole thing is Abraham and the prophets died, and we know they were good men and they obeyed. So how can you say that anyone who obeys will never taste death? And then verse 53 just gets me. Are you greater than Abraham? Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because we know the answer to that is yes, he is. But their whole thing is you're not greater than Abraham, and we know you're not. So who do you think you are? What does Jesus say in 54 to 56?
He just keeps pointing back to the Father and saying, God gives me glory.
Yep.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't glorify myself. I
Yeah.
do what the Father tells me to do.
That's right. It's like Jesus saying it doesn't matter who he thinks he is. It matters who the Father thinks he is. That's what matters. And if he makes claims to glorify himself, that's pointless. But if the Father, who the people claim is their God, if he glorifies Jesus, that's another story. And the thing is, the people don't really know the God they claim to worship. They don't know him, but Jesus does. And he says if he said he didn't know God, he'd be lying like they're saying, like they're lying when they say they do know him. But Jesus does know him. He knows him better than anyone, and he obeys his word. That's why Jesus is here, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. And then what does he say about Abraham?
Said, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad.
That's a funny thing to say. But I think the gist of it is when Abraham accepted by faith the promises of God, the promise of an inheritance, the promise of a descendant who would bless the nation, a promise of a sacrifice that would provide atonement when Isaac was spared. He was believing God for the promise that would be fulfilled in the Messiah. Ultimately, belief in those promises was a belief in the fulfillment that would come through what Jesus would do on the cross.
He also, I mean, this sounds weird, but is he referring to the fact that Abraham was alive and had
I think so,
seen him,
yes,
seen him?
I do. I think it's both. And, you know, the writer of Hebrews says, by faith Abraham was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. There's this idea that even though Christ hadn't been revealed, Abraham was trusting in the provision that would come through God's plan. He knew a day would come when it would all come to pass. He looked ahead to it, and he was glad. And if he is still alive, even though he's dead. If he's been given eternal life, then he is actually seeing the day that the Messiah arrives. He knows what's going on, and he rejoices over what it is that Jesus is doing to fulfill all of those promises. And Jesus basically says to the people, and that day's here, because here I am. Now, what did the people say to that in 57?
You're not 50 years old.
Yeah. I mean, Abraham's been dead for 2,000 years. Jesus isn't even 50. So how can he speak to anything about what Abraham thought or felt? How can he have any personal knowledge of Abraham? Now, I don't think that's a real question. I think it's the people saying, oh, please, be quiet already. But Jesus answers them anyway, and right here, he ratchets it up as tight as it will go. So what does he say?
Before Abraham was born, I am.
Okay, now let's talk about that. If all Jesus wanted to say was that he preceded Abraham, he would have said, before Abraham was, I was. And the people would have been like, you were not, you're an idiot, and that would have been that. But that's not what he says. He says, before Abraham was, I am. Why does he say it that way?
Because he is the I am.
Isn't that how God introduced himself to Moses?
Yes.
He said the I am.
Yep,
I am.
exactly.
And it's like,
When he identified himself to Moses as the God of Israel, that's the name that he used.
yeah.
And so here's Jesus taking the name of God, the name of their God, the name of the Old Testament God, and applying it to himself. Oh, boy. This is a lot heavier than just saying, I'm God. Because he's saying, I'm your God. I am the God who called Moses. That's who I am. Now, whatever the people have misunderstood before, there's no misunderstanding this. They know exactly what Jesus just said, because what do? Yep.
He's blaspheming.
They think he's blaspheming, and they're going to just kill him right here. I heard somebody say once, Jesus never claims to be God.
I know.
And I think, oh, Jesus claimed far heavier stuff than that. he claimed to be the I am, and they knew what he was saying because they were going to kill him for it.
I love that once again, it just really struck me this time. The miracle of disappearing in plain sight.
Yeah,
That just
Yeah.
floored me this time, the way it happened.
yeah. Yeah, they're trying to kill him, and he just slips off. Yeah.
And the way that it's written here, he went out, going in the midst of them, and
Yeah.
so passed by.
Yeah,
That's a miracle right there.
it is. Yeah. Okay, now don't miss the weight of what's happened since verse 31. So this whole dialogue has been a back and forth between Jesus and Jews who supposedly believed in him. So in a matter of 28 verses, they go from believing in him to trying to kill him. I mean, it's like 0 to 60 and nothing flat. How does that happen? What's your impression of that? That they believed in verse 30, and now they're trying to stone him to death.
That just proves that they're possessed by Satan.
Why didn't Jesus just leave well enough alone back in verse 30? Why didn't he just stand back and say, look at all these people who believe in me?
Because he
Fabulous.
knows their true hearts and knows that they really don't believe. I think
Mhm.
that's any time you take, I was thinking, actually, at the Mama Bear when they argued the skepticism, you could leave, well, like, we can be bygones and get along, but when you know the other person really isn't there, and you confront and you bring forth truth, you expose their unbelief, you expose that. And I think that's
you see how Jesus just keeps confronting them until not only their unbelief is exposed, but it becomes very clear what they're capable of doing. I'm sure that if he had stopped back in verse 31 and said, "No, all of you want to kill me," they'd have been like, "That's ridiculous." Well, he doesn't have to say it by the end of the chapter because they're actually trying to do it. To expose what they're capable of and the depth of an unbelief that on the surface looks like belief because they want to go along with, what sounds good at the moment. Jesus just isn't about that. And he confronts them. And he confronts them in such a way that their unbelief becomes unmistakable. There's nobody now walking away thinking they believe in Jesus when they actually don't. Yeah, it's heavy.
So what did they believe?
I think that they
He
liked...
was a good man,
I-
a prophet? They didn't believe he was God.
Once they walk away from this, I'm not really sure what they believe. I think they liked the miracles, and I suspect they probably liked him sticking it to the Pharisees. Like somebody who will stand up to the religious authorities and kind of, I don't know. But it's like, yeah, they believed in something on the surface until Jesus got to the real serious stuff about their sin. And that's what they didn't like.
Well, it's okay to put your clothes or
That's right. That's right. Let me read, we're going to end right here, but let me read something for you that made an impression on me. Throughout the ages and around the world, Jesus offends. He offends our self-sufficiency, our autonomy, our attempts to define for ourselves a belief system that we can live comfortably with. Even many who identify as Christian will inevitably encounter a teaching of Jesus that wounds and offends. How could it be otherwise when God is holy and just and we are not? So the question is, what will you do when Jesus offends you? Willingness to be offended by Jesus and to hold to his teaching and live by it defines what it means to be a true disciple. Well, that's for us too, isn't it? Is what do we do when Jesus offends us? Because he does. Grace offends us. We were just talking about that. Will we abide in his word and stick with him? Because that's what true disciples do. Okay, any last comments? Anything to add?
Will we be in John, this time next year?
I hope not, but we're going to be in John for a while longer.
I'm loving it. I'm loving it. But
Yeah.
this is this is going to be a while. We're going to continue to work through John. It's going to be
Yes.
very good.
Yes.
Maybe we could be working on it when you return.
That's right. This is great.
Okay, we'll stop there. All right, things to pray about?